This is what a brainstorming session looks like for the Grown Kid Talk Show. Just a guy by himself looking for topics.
Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show. Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show. Yo, Grown Kid Talk Show. Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show.
Let's get into Final Fantasy 16, 10 things we want Square to include by Sage Ashford, thegamer.com. I'm super excited to get back to my roots. Final Fantasy is my favorite franchise game of all time. No doubt, no question about it, and I'm very knowledgeable on the topic. And if you have been around the channel a long time, a really long time, you'll know that the channel started out as basically a Final Fantasy channel where I obviously talked about the game, but I'm kind of interested in this list because I haven't given Final Fantasy 16 much thought yet, and I think that's on purpose. Before we get into this, I think it's on purpose because we have the remake coming out, remasters. A lot of that has been talked about and is coming out next year, March 3rd. The Final Fantasy 7 remake. I was super skeptical at first. However, I am super optimistic now that more time has passed about the game. I really can't wait to see what they do and the changes they make. I'm really interested in the change. So that should give you a sign right there. I'm interested in Final Fantasy to always change and grow. So let's get into this list. I already love it because Final Fantasy 15's there. It's easily in my top 5 favorite Final Fantasies, if not top 3. I'd really have to think about that. Maybe we'll get to it later in the talk show, rounding off my favorite Final Fantasies in the mainline franchise, because if we add some non-mainlines, the list gets murky, and some games, that might not make that list. So let's get into it. Though it took nearly a decade for its initial reveal as Final Fantasy 13 Versus, Final Fantasy 15's finally in the rear view, both for gamers and for Square Enix. Just a preamble to the thing, article. Yeah, it's been a while since Final Fantasy 15 released. However, sorry, let me clear my throat. Shout out to Norman Reedus. Again, this video is not sponsored by Monster, but Death Stranding is amazing. Crunch. Nah, I was just doing exactly what he did. Shout out in the comments if you got the reference there. Anyway, PC is really where Final Fantasy 15 can live due to the mods, due to the creation aspects. That's something that's totally overlooked on console users that is mainly Final Fantasy's draw, has always been console. However, the huge PC push can no longer go unnoticed by the hardcore Final Fantasy fans. So that's really exciting. So let's just keep going on in the article here. Number 10, An Expansive World. Final Fantasy 15 was pretty big, and by the way things are going, it's more likely than not that this game will be even larger. That's fine, but make sure the size of the world has a purpose. Give a unique visual identity to every city and every country we run into. Make the monsters stand out from one another and give the dungeons their own unique feel. Even the kind of side content should change based on the areas we're in. There's no need to make the game big for the sake of being big when the current wave is about being dense over the actual size of the game's world. This is a little jab at Final Fantasy 15. Its early critique is that the world was so big it felt empty. And I get that critique, and it is a valid critique, and I'm not going to really dispute that. Only thing I'm going to really stay on is that a game's world, and I've noticed this more by playing Death Stranding, because again, you could say the same things about that, in that it feels empty. When you're used to corridor games or games that don't allow a free range of motion, you're constantly bombarded with activities or engagement. And in terms of Final Fantasy, that engagement usually comes on the map from your instanced turn-based battles. Whether it's not really often that the monster is on the map, so you're taken out of the game world into the simulated box fighting arena, and that has always really drived Final Fantasy's in terms of their world, because you do spend a lot of time in that battle screen, so to speak. Final Fantasy 15 really took everything that they tried to do with a Final Fantasy 12, a Final Fantasy 13, and put it in the modern era, and I think they did that extremely well. And I think with Final Fantasy 7, we're going to see some more of those elements. However, it's going to be received better. Obviously, with the passage of time, you're supposed to get better at things, but it's also going to be received better due to the fact that everybody already knows what Final Fantasy 7 is, everything about the game. There's nothing new to the game that a person would gain from a direct remaster. It's only in a remake that they're going to be able to give us new things, and I think the feel of an open world, Square has gotten it. Square catches a lot of heat sometimes for reasons that I don't necessarily agree with, due to the fact that they try to take risks in their mainline franchise. I mean, every time you play let's say a Gears of War game, that Gears of War game plays the same, right? Like, or every time you play a Metal Gear Solid, they play the same. It's not often that you get a franchise like Final Fantasy that is very much like the Twilight Zone of TV, right? You can get something new and different almost every installment, and it's only the installment that they decide to revert to old habits or take this or that you can feel the stagnation. But for the most part, if you looked at Final Fantasy 15 to Final Fantasy 10, you'd be like, oh wow, these are two completely different games, and I think that should be way more commended than it is when people talk Final Fantasy. But let's get to number 9. Plenty of side quests. The current wave for video games in general is to make them longer, presumably out of the desire to keep the players from completing them in a week or two and taking them back to the store. If that's the case, then make sure we can actually get something out of it. Take a page out of the notebook of games like The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt and offer some proper side quests, not just a noteboard to take generic assignments from, build some stories around it, add some characters who can play as quest givers who have their own narratives. Again, I think this is a shot to Final Fantasy 15, and you might be surprised I'm saying that, but you really shouldn't, because another critique of Final Fantasy 15 was that these side quests were not worthwhile. You may think I'm reading too much into this. To that argument, I say no, because these are the critiques that came about when Final Fantasy 15, and it's only natural that you remember the latest installment of something when you are going to talk about the next installment. Like I said, these games don't necessarily follow a linear story. They don't necessarily have the same stuff going on, same setup at all. So you can only really talk about what has previously been out. So again, this is a knock to Final Fantasy 15. I understand the knock, again, I do. However, I'm more of a completionist type of gamer, and not so much completionist where I have a guide up, where I'm looking at the guide, I'm in this area, I'm doing that. I would do that with like a guide book back in the day, but I will play it till full, until I feel like I really did everything the game had to offer. And with Final Fantasy 15, I did like the side quests. It wasn't that I just disliked them, it was that the purpose of the side quests in 15 wasn't central like the side quests in other Final Fantasies, and I think that's where the disconnect comes. The side quests in 15 were more of you're on your way to this spot and you'll stop here to do this little thing and continue with the story. This was a very much story-driven game, and you weren't, even though they gave you the option to travel back in time and do some things, you're really not supposed to do that. You really should play. It's almost one of those games that you don't want 100% on your first playthrough. You really just want to go from spot to spot and play that main story campaign all the way through and really feel it. I realized, and then go back as your Final Fantasy fan and you want to really delve deeper into the themes of the game and the story and the lore, and that's where your second playthrough is. The thing is, most mainstream gamers do not play games more than one time. Now you watching this channel, this obscure YouTube channel, you may be one of those people who do play games multiple times. I'm one of those people who generally do not play a game multiple times because, like I said, I will do as much as I can in that first playthrough. If a game has multiple endings, I will live with the ending that I got. However, I will change my mind if that's not canon. For example, the instance of Final Fantasy X2. Canon is actually the perfect ending. We know that. That's what it is. You know, you can express your qualms about it in the comments. I have plenty of videos on Final Fantasy X and X2. However, that is canon. So, I mean, I did replay that multiple times. I played, you know, a few games multiple times. But I don't genuinely get a new game and play it, you know, back to back. Or, frankly, I'll play it again because I really do invest in the story that first time. And Final Fantasy 15 wasn't that side quest type of game. However, if you were to play Final Fantasy 15 now, with all the DLC, all the extra content, there is so much extra content now that it's actually ridiculous if you pop in Final Fantasy 15 for the first time right now. I'm quite jealous of what you get to play, because I did play, I think all of the content that they added, except for maybe one thing. Some of the content's amazing. And is DLC side quests? That's a question. I guess maybe there should be a topic on the show. Is DLC, you know, is it a side? In essence, it's basically a side quest. It's added on content, you know, for the game. And FF15 has some great priced DLCs, $5 a pop for each main character's story, and that was really dope. So I'd have to kind of disagree on the arguments for Final Fantasy 15 having worse side quest if we're counting the DLC, but let's move on because I can talk forever about Final Fantasy.
Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show.